You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth. Hey!
Spanning the globe to bring you the latest developments in medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja.
We love the herb.
It's time for the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville. Now, here's your host, Russ Belville.
Good day, tokers and tokettes and non-toking lovers of liberty. It is Monday, October 2nd, 2017, and it's got to be 420 somewhere in the world. We come to you today on a very, very tragic occasion. Two tragedies took place in Las Vegas. The shooting that took place at the Mandalay Bay over at the country concert. We're still getting the news coming in. 58 killed, 515 wounded. And I'm not going to get into that debate on today's show, but if you'd like to know my latest thoughts on it, I do now have a new Tumblr account at radicalruss.tumblr.com if you'd like to read the latest on that. And if you hadn't heard the news and maybe wondered why I was playing so much Tom Petty to start the show today or to prep the show today, because Tom Petty was found unresponsive from a heart attack in his hotel room and was taken off life support today. So Tom Petty has passed away, a longtime rocker with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers and so many iconic songs. Such a great friend to the cannabis movement as well. Let's get to the point. Let's roll another joint. We will miss Tom Petty, certainly. All right, coming up on today's show, we've got our cannabis headline news and great news coming from our friend Tom Angel with the Marijuana Moment newsletter. He's debuting marijuanamoment.net as a news portal. You got to get this into your bookmarks immediately and do what you can to help subscribe and help to keep Tom on the internet, because his news site and newsletter are so invaluable to those of us who are fighting this fight, and I couldn't do this show without him. So if you check it out today, please bookmark that site, marijuanamoment.net. He's got a very interesting discovery of an obscure federal law from the 70s that may make it legal to fly state legal marijuana across the country. So we'll take a look at that. Also, we've got our interview with Dr. Mitch and our cannabis Q&A. He's going to tackle that fentanyl-laced marijuana rumor. Plus, we got some news on some of the latest studies, some of the things we've been doing to mice to figure out if cannabis is good or bad for people. And I'll rant a little bit about our about the dumbest marijuana talking point.
This is your Cannabis Headline News. Brought to you by marijuanamoment.net, the complete source for all your marijuana news in one morning newsletter from Marijuana Majority Founder Tom Angel. Subscribe today for free at marijuanamoment.net.
This is your Cannabis Headline News for Monday, October 2nd, 2017. I'm Russ Belville. Today is the 80th anniversary of the enactment of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, the federal law that marked the beginning of modern U.S. marijuana prohibition. On October 2nd, 1937, House Bill 6385, the Marijuana Tax Act, was enacted as law. Congress held only 2 hearings to debate the merits of the Marijuana Tax Act, which largely consisted of sensational testimony by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics Director Harry J. Anslinger, who held the post from 1930 through 1962. Despite testimony from a representative of the American Medical Association that passage of the act would severely hamper physicians' ability to prescribe cannabis as medicine, members of Congress readily approved the bill, which President Franklin Roosevelt promptly signed into law on August 2, 1937. The act effectively banned cannabis until 1969, when Dr. Timothy Leary convinced the Supreme Court that being forced to present illegal cannabis for the purpose of acquiring the legal stamp amounted to unconstitutional self-incrimination. Congress swiftly responded with passage of the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which continues marijuana prohibition to this day. The premiere of the new MarijuanaMoment.net cannabis news portal leads with the discovery of an obscure 1972 federal aviation law that allows, quote, carriage of narcotic drugs, marijuana, and depressant or stimulant drugs or substances authorized by or under any federal or state statute or by any federal or state agency, end quote. Tom Angel writes, quote, "While it is possible that FAA didn't actually mean in 1972 to protect consumers carrying future legal cannabis in the sky and may have just meant to make sure law enforcement could legally transport seized contraband, a plain reading of the regulation would seem to have that perhaps unintended effect today," end quote. If indeed federal law allows transport of state legal cannabis, states like Washington, Alaska, and Hawaii could see relief for their efforts to supply legal marijuana to islands accessible only through federally regulated air and sea routes. U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services Tom Price, a marijuana opponent who would have been a key decider on cannabis rescheduling petitions, resigned following controversy surrounding his use of private planes. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health and Director of the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, Don J. Wright of Virginia, will take over as acting secretary until a permanent replacement is confirmed. The Washington Post noted that Price's anti-marijuana record included going against a measure that would prevent the Justice Department from interfering with state recreational marijuana laws, voting 6 times against amendments preventing the Justice Department from interfering with state medical marijuana laws, and voting 3 times against a measure that would allow Veterans Affairs doctors to recommend medical marijuana to veterans who might benefit from it. Members of Maryland's Legislative Black Caucus suggested they would stop cooperating with leadership if lawmakers fail to pass legislation ensuring racial diversity in the state's medical cannabis industry. The Baltimore Sun writes that some members suggested the powerful voting bloc should take a knee if the legislation is not on the governor's desk by the end of January. During a wide-ranging public forum in Annapolis on Saturday, caucus chairwoman Cheryl Glenn for the first time outlined promises she said General Assembly leaders made about medical marijuana legislation, which is one of the group's top priorities. She said it will receive an unusual expedited joint House and Senate hearing on the first Monday of the session, which happens to be Martin Luther King Jr. Day. If that does not happen, some members said the 50-member caucus, which makes up more than a quarter of the legislature and 40% of the Democratic caucus, will not cooperate with leadership on anything else. Marijuana arrests plunged in 2016 in the state of Massachusetts, but racial disparity in remaining arrests persisted. The Boston Globe noted that legalization passed in 2016 went into effect in mid-December, so the statistics reflect the results of decrim in 2008 and medical marijuana in 2012. 545 people were arrested in Massachusetts in 2016 for selling or growing marijuana. That's down from over 1,000 in 2013. And 308 people were arrested for possession, down 96.5% since the decrim in 2008. But 28.9% of those arrested for marijuana possession in 2016 were black, in a state whose population was 8.6% black last year.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
Hi, I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. If you appreciate my full-time dedication to reporting and analyzing the news about cannabis, consider becoming a patron of the show. For just $4.20 per month, you'll help keep my live stream and podcast free while earning yourself your own private ad-free podcast link for the show, as well as links to the supporting articles and data. For a $9.99 VIP subscription, you'll get all that, plus my exclusive research, data tables, and graphics. Just log on to mjagenda.com and click the Become a Patron button today.
The Marijuana Agenda. Like the pharmaceutical agenda, without all the side effects, overdose deaths, insurance.
Side effects may include nausea, dry mouth, and constipation. Dry mouth, constipation, indigestion, and abdominal pain,
which can occur without warning and may cause death.
At Herbie's Cannabis Seeds, we pride ourselves on bringing you the best quality seeds from the world's most respected cannabis seed producers, all at the lowest online prices. You can find Herbie's Seeds at herbiesheadshop.com. All cannabis seeds are sold as souvenirs and as a means of preserving cannabis genetics. Herbie's Seeds in no way intends to condone, promote, or incite the use of illegal or controlled substances. We strongly urge all prospective customers to check their national laws prior to placing an order. Herbie's Seeds at herbiesheadshop.com. Proud sponsors of the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
This is Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. Dr. Earlywine is a professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Albany and author of numerous books and columns on cannabis science, culture, history, and medicine. Email your questions to Dr. Earlywine at 420research@gmail.com or call the Marijuana Agenda message line at 650-LEGAL-MJ. Now, here's your Cannabis Q&A.
Welcome back, everyone, for another edition of Cannabis Q&A with our special guest, Dr. Mitch Earlywine, joining us by telephone. Hello, Dr. Mitch.
Hey.
We're back. It's been a while since we had the chance to talk to you. I hope everything has gone well for you this summer.
In fact, it has, and the semester's starting off really nicely.
Any new research papers or studies that you guys are working on there in Albany?
Believe it or not, we're going to prove the obvious yet again with a new study on cannabis and sleep. What a surprise. It's a big help.
Well, all right. If anyone's interested in those kind of studies or has suggestions for others, remember, you can always email Dr. Mitch at 420research@gmail.com. And speaking of the 420 Research, we've got a whole bunch of studies to take a look at, some good, some bad on today's episode. Let's start with this one because it has to do with a substance I'd never heard of before, N-acetylcysteine. Acetylcysteine, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this study that says there's no evidence that this drug, which they'd used on adolescents to get them to stop smoking pot, doesn't work so well on adults. Can you clue us in on this supposed anti-pot substance?
Well, so the thing to understand is this really works in glutamate, the system that's sort of the newest of the neurotransmitter systems that have been discovered. If you know MSG, the monosodium glutamate, you sort of know the role of it. The bottom line was they had some evidence when this was used in conjunction with a pretty strict behavioral intervention with adolescents. It did help those adolescents be more likely to give clean urine screens. It's not generalizing to the adults. I'm not sure why. My first suspicion was, they don't have enough statistical power. As it turns out, they've got over 300, or they've got 300 adults in this study. I'm starting to wonder if maybe the first one was a fluke. The glutamate system is pretty far downstream from the cannabinoid system, and I'm guessing that this certainly isn't going to work by itself, and we need more evidence to see if it would really help. But in truth, I wish they were measuring cannabis problems rather than urine screens. So I don't really care if somebody smokes a joint once in a while. I just want to see that they don't develop any problems, and I somehow doubt that they need to have their glutamate receptors tinkled in order to do that.
I'm wondering what is the mechanism for this N-acetylcysteine. Is it like, I used to hear of antabuse that would make alcoholics sick if they drank alcohol. Does it work like that? Does it cause some sort of physical reaction to cannabis?
Fortunately, no. What has happened is they've sort of generalized from other animal literature where the rodents basically who got this were just less likely to press the bar for some of the psychostimulants, cocaine and amphetamine and the Adderall type ones. And they thought, well, let's go ahead and try it on humans and with some other drugs. It doesn't seem to really generalize, and the tacit assumption that somehow you just need glutamate to function differently in order to avoid cannabis is pretty far away from the more direct idea of, say, using THC, which is pretty comical, or using some kind of cannabinoid blocker, which would just be depressing and terrible.
All right. Well, the big story that we have in drug reform these days has to do, of course, with the unfolding opiate overdose crisis. And one of the ways this ties into the marijuana world is that we hear reports from high-ranking officials. Even Senator Rob Portman from Ohio once mentioned something about fentanyl-laced marijuana, that heavy-duty opioid that's so much stronger than heroin or morphine, supposedly being added to samples of marijuana and then sold on the streets, and then people overdose from it. Now the myth-debunking site Snopes has come out to say this is false. And Dr. Mitch, I just wanted to know if you had anything to add about this scare about the fentanyl-laced marijuana.
As soon as I heard about this, I thought, who in their right mind would do this? Fentanyl is really pricey. Fentanyl is really hard to get, and it's an opiate. So nobody who wants cannabis really wants it, and it's not like lacing your cannabis with fentanyl is going to somehow save you money or anything. So it just seemed cockamamie from the beginning, and I'm glad to see that it's been debunked. And I feel like this is just another problem with the underground market. We should all be able to go to the store and make sure our cannabis is really cannabis.
It reminds me of the scare of the pot-laced Halloween candy that we're due for here at the end of this month, where supposedly we're going to replace a 15-cent Tootsie Roll with a $15 Chiba Chew.
I sure would like to come to that house.
All right. We were speaking earlier about mice getting high, and there's another study out with mice showing a potential therapeutic use of phytocannabinoids, the scientific term for plant-based cannabinoids, or THC, CBD, etc., in alcohol-related problems. So if we've got a problem with alcoholic mice, Dr. Mitch, can we get them high?
As it turns out, we just might. I liked the previous study better because it was really looking at neurological damage created by alcohol. This is about a stimulating effect that seems to happen in response to alcohol and tends to get worse as the doses increase across time. When you've got THC in particular in the mouse's system, they do end up not showing that exaggerated hyperkinetic sort of spazzy reaction to alcohol later on, and that's a good sign that cannabis might be a buffer against alcohol-related problems in general, but that's not a problem that's really a big one for humans as far as I'm concerned.
You know, I always wondered if mice ever got together for like their high school reunions to talk about the studies they've been on. How was it for you, Bob? Well, I had a human ear sewed to me. How was it for you? Hey, I got drunk as hell. All right, let's get to some of these other studies. There's a study that concludes, some of these are some bad news studies from our point of view, a study that concluded that cannabis use appears to increase rather than decrease the risk of developing non-medical prescription opioid use and opioid use disorder. Now, this is NIDA coming out with this, supposedly rebutting the idea that cannabis helps reduce the opiate crisis. So what can we learn from this?
Well, so the way they ask the question is a little ass backwards compared to the way we've seen it done in the past. So Philippe Lucas, some of my data, those studies, we tend to ask folks who are medical cannabis users, what are you using it for? And they say, I'm doing it to get off opiates. That's delightful, and I certainly believe them and think it's a neat approach. What they did in this study was just ask folks who have used cannabis, have they also used non-medical prescription opiates? And of course they have. People who like to use drugs like to use drugs. That's not exactly news, but it certainly doesn't mean that the cannabis caused this. It says there's a subset of folks who are interested in experimenting in sort of thrill and adventure and drug use. So I understand their concern. It is true that people who use cannabis are more at risk for developing other drug problems, but that doesn't mean that cannabis couldn't help these folks get off the opiates if they were motivated.
You know, this ties into some statistics I read Maya Zalovitz put out recently, where she talked about a national survey on drug use and health showing that people who ended up with a dependency problem on opiates, more than half of them got that through getting it from someone they knew, a friend or a family member who had a prescription for it. So is this to say then that the folks who aren't so worried about breaking the social norms of marijuana being illegal also aren't so worried about breaking the social norms of getting your own prescription when you have a backache rather than borrowing someone else's?
Exactly. And I do feel like this says more about people than it does about the plant.
Okay. Another study coming out says enacting medical cannabis laws increases Social Security disability insurance claims, and that could cause an increased reliance on costly social insurance programs. Basically trying to say if you legalize the medical marijuana, you're going to have more people sucking off the government teat. What's the gist of this study?
So 58 pages into this, I finally found like what's really going on, and it's a whopping 0.27% increase. So I don't really feel like we can make too much of this. Yes, it's statistically significant because the sample is enormous, and then they were trying to say something about workman's comp, too, but when you start adding the covariates that you should normally add, like gender and socioeconomic status and things like that, it wasn't significant anymore. So I admire the savvy that these guys went through. They did a ton of really good regression analyses, tested all the assumptions, but the size of this effect is so small and only significant because the sample is so big that it doesn't make any sense to me. And I want to emphasize that people don't pass medical cannabis laws at random. It could very well have been that folks who were already hurting and, essentially qualified for disability were also the same folks who voted for those laws in the first place.
Also, something like this wouldn't take into account the reductions in public costs that you get from not busting patients who might be trying to use cannabis to get by.
Oh, and just the number who aren't going to end up in jail because they're infuriated.
Yeah, there we go. Our final bit of science and health news in the world of cannabis today comes from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, who are urging pregnant women to discontinue marijuana use, even for medical purposes. We don't usually get any good news from the medical associations. They seem to be really stuck in the status quo. Is this something that pregnant women should be taking to heart, or maybe with a little of a grain of salt?
Well, it's funny because there aren't any new data here at all. They literally just cited the old studies that we've mentioned before. There are some studies where it really does say, hey, you're more likely to end up with your baby in the NICU if you're a heavy cannabis user, even after we've covariated out all these socioeconomic things. I can't, say, oh, hey, no problem, don't worry. But I feel like these guys came out in this direction in part because they're afraid if they say anything else, they're really going to get in trouble. So I don't know what to say. If you're super nauseated during pregnancy, or if you're already a medical cannabis user, talk it over with your physician. Go ahead and take a look at those original data, because we're talking about, at most a doubling of the risk for some of these things. And I would bet that if you took good care of your health in all these other domains, things would be fine, but I'm not an obstetrician.
All right, we'll have to leave it at that. Dr. Mitch Earlywine is a board member for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws and the author of numerous books on cannabis and health. So make sure you check him out. And Dr. Mitch, you can reach him at 420research@gmail.com. Mitch, thanks so much for joining us again here for some Cannabis Q&A.
Nice to hear your voice. Talk to you later.
This episode was produced as part of the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville, the daily news and interview podcast covering the world of medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja. MJAgenda.com.
New beginner guitars and banjos are often constructed much better than ones built before your time. Why struggle? Get a new instrument or fix the old one. The trusted professionals at the Fingerboard Extension will evaluate your instrument for free. Repairs are priced for people who work for a living. Stop by the Fingerboard Extension downtown Corvallis at 120 Northwest 2nd Street today, or check out its inventory on the web at fingerboardextension.com.
The Marijuana Agenda, like the alcohol agenda. But a lot safer.
Hey everybody, it's Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda, inviting you to be like me and get your ink done at Lucky Horseshoe Tattoo, Fort Worth's most female-friendly, clean, sterile, awesome tattoo shop. Thomas and his crew are true artists who can design you a custom piece or use a design you bring in. Lucky Horseshoe also offers all styles of tattooing as well as piercings and all-around fun. In the DFW area, stop by Lucky Horseshoe Tattoo and tell them Radical Russ sent you. Trust me, it'll feel awesome.
Total war against public enemy number one.
10 federal criminal penalties for 1 ounce of marijuana.
Marijuana is probably the most dangerous drug.
Just say no.
Legalization is just another word for surrender.
I experimented with marijuana and didn't inhale.
This is not medicine. This is a Cheech and Chong show. Encourage people to use less drugs.
I am ill.
That was the point.
I think it would be a mistake to legalize.
Negative reports coming out of Colorado.
People don't smoke marijuana.
Radical Rant.
This here ain't your father's Woodstock weed. Today's marijuana is far more potent. That's one of the longest running talking points we've heard from the prohibitionists whenever the people begin considering reforming their marijuana laws. Whether it's North American prohibitionists citing the increased potency of marijuana samples seized by the DEA, or European prohibitionists sounding the alarm about skunk Being an entirely different drug than cannabis, the point is the same. Forget what you thought you knew about the harmless grass you smoked back in the day, parents. Modern weed will hurt your kids. The most recent example of this Woodstock weed worry comes from Mitt Romney's nephew, Doug Robinson. He's the prohibitionist who formed the anti-marijuana group Smart Colorado after the passage of Amendment 64 in 2012 legalized the adult sales, cultivation, and use of cannabis. Robinson is now a GOP candidate for governor of Colorado, and at an appearance, Robinson expressed his vision for the Centennial State in a story reported in the Fort Morgan Times. He said, quote, "Frankly, while Colorado is doing okay, there are a number of challenges that I see, and I am concerned about the direction of our state. I don't see us drifting to a better place. I think we need strong leadership to guide us there," end quote. And one of the challenges that Robinson is concerned about is what he calls the, quote, marijuana crisis, end quote. According to the Times, he said, quote, "We've got to educate our kids. I think our kids have the belief that since this is legal, it must be okay. And then the potency of the products is extremely different than what it was in the 60s and the 70s, end quote." Well, let's just unpack how stupid this not your father's Woodstock weed talking point is. Folks, the Summer of Love was a half century ago. In January of 1967, Dr. Timothy Leary encouraged the youth to turn on, tune in, and drop out at the Human Bee Inn. That summer, around 100,000 young people converged on the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco in what became known as the Summer of Love. 2 years later, on the other side of the continent, 500,000 young people converged on Yasgur's Farm in New York to enjoy the Woodstock Music and Art Fair. That generation is now eligible for Social Security. So, unless Doug Robinson is talking to guys like Tony Randall, Charlie Chaplin, and President Tyler's son, who become fathers in their 70s, who cares how weak the swag of the 60s and 70s was? Are the kids these days really taking their cues on marijuana safety from their grandpa's memory of the hippie lettuce? And another way this is stupid, there was hash available in the 60s and 70s, folks. The idea that marijuana today has become 37 times more potent than what they smoked at Woodstock is based on comparing the lowest average THC in illicit samples seized by the feds in the 60s and 70s and comparing them to the highest averages you find in seizures today. But when you're talking about a variable product, a living plant like cannabis, the average of what cops seize doesn't really tell you very much. It's like saying the average weight of dogs adopted at one dog shelter is 10 pounds, and the average weight of dogs adopted at another shelter is 20 pounds. Well, maybe a bunch of the people at Shelter 1 adopted Chihuahuas, but the place was still full of sheepdogs that didn't go out. Maybe Shelter 2 adopted out a Great Dane and a St. Bernard that boosted the overall average, but otherwise they adopted out a bunch of Jack Russell Terriers. Maybe Shelter 1 is in the city and Shelter 2 is near a bunch of farms where they need larger dogs. What the average doesn't tell us is that any randomly selected dog in Shelter 1 is half the size of any randomly selected dog in Shelter 2. But that's how the Woodstock weed talking point works. The scare is that whatever it was you were smoking back in the day as a parent had to be weaker than what the kids are smoking today, so you can't trust your own experience. But there was hash available back in the day. There were potent strains available back in the day. Ask any OG about Maui Wowie, Panama Red, Acapulco Gold, and Thai Stick. I mean, you don't think Cheech and Chong, the Doobie Brothers, and Bill Walton were smoking 1% THC weed, do you? And neither were many of the grandparents that Doug Robinson is talking about. I mean, look at the pictures of what they were wearing back then. Somebody was high enough to decide that bell bottoms looked good. And understand, they said the same thing last decade, decade before that, and the decade before that one too. I'm not trying to convince you that today's weed isn't better than the weed of yesteryear on average. We have, thanks to prohibition, developed fantastic indoor horticultural techniques that have increased the availability of potent marijuana. But it's not like that happened all of a sudden on the day Colorado and Washington legalized marijuana for adults. The reported average potency of seized marijuana has been increasing for the past 4 decades, along with the fear-mongering about it. You go back to the late 2000s, Miami's DEA chief, Mark R. Trouville, warned, quote, "This ain't your grandfather's or your father's marijuana. This will hurt you. This will addict you. This will kill you." End quote. The early 2000s, former drug czar John Walters warned, quote, "The THC of today's Sinsemilla averages 14% and ranges as high as 30%. It has increased as much as 30 times." End quote. In the late 1990s, then Senator Joe Biden warned about 90s weed compared to 70s weed, saying, quote, "It's like comparing buckshot in a shotgun shell to a laser-guided missile." End quote. Go back to the early 1990s. Drug czar Lee Brown warned, quote, "Marijuana is 40 times more potent today than 10, 15, 20 years ago." End quote. Go back to the late 1980s. Dr. Richard Hawks of NIDA warned, quote, "Parents who experimented with marijuana in their youth are not aware that the potency is much higher." End quote. Even the early 1980s, UCLA psychiatry professor Sidney Cohen warned, quote, "Material 10 or more times potent than the marijuana smoked 10 years ago is being used, and the intoxicated state is more intense and lasts longer." End quote. And if they were lying then, I mean, think about it. If the 70s weed was allegedly 1% THC, and then it became 10 or more times potent in the 1980s, and then it became 40 times more potent than 10 years ago in the 1990s, and then increased as much as 30 times in the 2000s, then we're all smoking 12,000% THC marijuana today. And the other thing about this Woodstock weed talking point is Woodstock weed is still just as illegal. Justifying the criminalization of today's marijuana because it's a super potent version, unlike your grandfather's Woodstock weed, also reveals the prohibitionist concern about safety to be disingenuous, because Woodstock weed is just as illegal as the chronic. See, back in the 1970s, government officials were telling us that smoking the Woodstock weed would lead to a motivational syndrome, heroin addiction, and man boobs. And when that was revealed to be untrue over the next decades, those officials told us, oh, well, now we'll start seeing other new terrible effects from the new pot 2.0 that's so much more potent. So then, can we make the Woodstock weed legal? Since Doug Robinson and these other prohibitionists are essentially admitting it wasn't so bad back in the day. You know, like when we first made 3-2 beer legal after the end of alcohol prohibition. Interesting history on that, by the way. Congress passed the 21st Amendment that repealed prohibition in January of 1930, but 2/3 of the states still had to ratify it. So federally, it was thought, alcohol was legal, but the states still hadn't approved it. So in March 1930, Congress rewrote the Volstead Act, which defined the intoxicating beverages that the 18th Amendment prohibited, which covered anything with more than 0.5% alcohol. So all they did was they raised the limit. They said the Volstead Act banned anything that's over 3.2% alcohol. So that allowed the brewers, Anheuser-Busch and Miller and these guys, to start getting light beer flowing immediately. This 3-2 beer could be flowing immediately while the states took the next 8 months to ratify the 21st Amendment to make the rest of the alcohol legal. So imagine that we could take that same route today. All we'd have to do really is rewrite hemp laws to include all cannabis with, say, up to 12% THC or whatever. Anyway, if they were lying to us then about the terrible effects we'd get from weak pot, why should we believe them now when they're talking about the dangers of more potent pot? And when we talk about this alleged danger, let's keep in mind, marijuana is non-toxic. So who cares how potent it is? I mean, if this potency thing is such a huge concern, you'd think that prohibitionists would want to see that potency number labeled clearly on all marijuana products, accompanied by an advertising campaign to educate consumers about responsible use, and sell it only in opaque child-proof containers in adults-only stores that check identification. I mean, you can't imagine these prohibitionists would be behind legislation to allow alcohol purveyors to just sell bottles of booze with no proof on them, with no warnings about, pregnant women or anything like that. Just, like the old granny XXX jug. Here, booze, right? That would be ridiculous, right? But that's what they're supporting for marijuana sales. They want to pretend marijuana sales can be legislated out of existence, as if we can repeal the law of supply and demand. No, all you're saying is we'd prefer the sales to be unregulated, unchecked, unlicensed, uninspected. That's what you're saying. You're supporting the status quo. And this status quo forced clandestine growers to breed out CBD and increase THC because in an underground market, the dealers have to maximize their intoxication to profit ratio to offset the risk of getting caught. This is called the iron law of prohibition. Former Normal director Dick Cowan came up with this. The iron law of prohibition. During prohibition, the bootlegger had the trunk of his car in which to smuggle forbidden alcohol from Canada. Whiskey fetches greater profits than beer, and a load of either gets him just as busted, so he picks the whiskey. On the drinker's side, if two bootleggers are selling whiskey at the same price, the scarcity of whiskey makes the drinker opt for the more potent whiskey, which he could dilute more to get by. The iron law of prohibition, folks, if you prohibit a drug, you will get more potent versions of it. Not just alcohol, see also crack, meth, carfentanil, and of course, marijuana. They're fighting to ensure that this product, marijuana, gets sold in unmarked baggies by unlicensed dealers who think nothing of selling to kids. That's what they support. Now, the reason this Woodstock weed scare even works, partially, is because people know that more potent alcohol gets them drunk faster, and drinking too much too fast leads to sickness and possibly death. Or they know that fentanyl is more powerful than OxyContin, which is more powerful than morphine, which is more powerful than opium, and we got this huge opioid crisis, so more powerful marijuana must be a bad thing. But marijuana is non-toxic. No matter how potent it is, no amount of it is going to kill you. It's not the potency that matters, it's the high that matters. Not how quickly you got high, but just getting high. See, prohibitionists, they like to say that more potent marijuana is more addictive. But that's like saying people are more likely to become alcoholics if they drink whiskey instead of beer. Trust me, folks, there's plenty of beer-only alcoholics in the world. And plus, it kind of messes with their theory about this more potent marijuana when you show them the stats of marijuana use and marijuana rehab admissions that go both up and down over the past 4 decades, while potency has only gone up. Kind of blows the correlation. See, what you need to do here is to get down to the actual gist of why people smoke marijuana. To get high. That's it. To change their outlook, to change their effect, to change their perception, to relax, to medicate, however you want to describe it. People do this in search of a specific effect. For the same reason, it's the same logic behind why people drink alcohol. To have a specific effect. To feel a specific effect. In either case, if someone has a dependency issue, it's the effect they're dependent on, not the particular grade of intoxicant. An alcoholic who wants to get drunk will drink whiskey if it's there, beer if it's not. Hell, they'll drink Aqua Velva or hand sanitizer to get a buzz on. Look, as travel writer and normal board member Rick Steves likes to say, high is a place. Pot smokers just want to get there. Doesn't matter if they get there on the 1970s ditchweed dirt bike or the 1990s chronic car or the 2010s top shelf train. The trip may be faster these days, but the destination is the same. The point of using marijuana is to experience the high. And since marijuana smoking, the inhalation, whether you're smoking or for that matter vaporizing, since inhalation is such an immediate effect, you use it until you get to the place you want to be. You don't keep using it. This is not analogous to alcohol. With alcohol, you might drink shot 1, shot 2, shot 3, shot 4, shot 5, looking for a buzz, and then 20 minutes later realize, oh, I should have stopped at shot 3. Because there's a time delay there. This could also be applied to edibles with cannabis as well. So I'm not just, speaking out against alcohol here. Anything that you ingest takes 20 to 45 minutes to kick in. Can be more difficult for you to gauge where you're going to be. This does not have that effect. Smoking cannabis tells you where you're at immediately. You smoke enough of it to get high. Now, again, back in the day, in the 70s, that might have been smoking a whole joint. Today, that might be smoking 3 or 4 puffs off a joint, or maybe just a small dab of concentrate. See, these prohibitionists want to pretend like people that smoke weed are going to smoke the same amount of weed even as it gets more potent, right? People that smoke 2 joints in the morning back in the day when it was 2 weak joints are now going to smoke 2 joints every day when it's super strong stuff. And that's not necessarily the facts here. That's not necessarily how it works. Any more so than the person who likes to have whiskey on the rocks is going to drink them in 22-ounce pints, right? Like they would a beer. And this is another aspect where prohibition messes around with the safety profile of cannabis. When it comes to alcohol, being that it's so socially and culturally accepted, being that it's ubiquitous in our society, we have culturally come up with mores about drinking. We've come up with basic standards when it comes to drinking. We know that you don't order tequila in 22-ounce pint bottles or glasses. We know that each one has their own sort of settings. We know that kids that are chugging beers and doing Jaeger bombs and stuff are behaving irresponsibly and childishly. We have a culture around this. With marijuana, it being prohibited keeps us from being able to develop these cultural norms that would better regulate, that would better control social use than keeping it hidden, keeping it clandestine, keeping it in the closet. People who are new to marijuana smoking, who might have a chance to go to a legal cannabis lounge, would have the opportunity to learn from others who are more experienced consumers how big of a dab to take, to sit down if they're going to take a dab, to stay hydrated, to learn what strains of marijuana have what specific effects, to know when you're too high and what techniques you may use to deal with that situation. But by keeping it secret, keeping it illegal and underground, we prevent ourselves from having any of those sorts of social mores setting up in our society. So for Colorado Governor hopeful Doug Robinson, Mitt Romney's nephew, to repeat these same tired old not your grandfather's Woodstock weed talking points shows how shallow the other side still is when it comes to discussing this issue, even 5 years into our legalization and 60% support in the polls. That's all the time we got. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, take care of each other, tokers.
Follow MJ Agenda on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, YouTube, and follow MJ Agenda Show on Twitter. Learn more at mjagenda.com.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you